Bonjour tout le monde. Good morning. Bonjour. First, I'd like to thank the elders, an esteemed circle of elders who helped us begin today's listening exercise and sharing of wisdom, and recognize as well that we're on Treaty 1 territories, which include the Cree, the Ojibwe, the Dakota peoples, the Anishinaabe peoples, as well as being on the traditional homelands of the Métis Nation, one of the founders of Confederation in some ways, and not necessarily recognized enough for the extraordinary contribution that all of your nations have made in various ways. We're also joined, of course, by Inuit leaders, and the trilogy or that trinity of experiences is important to also understand that we have a fourth direction present as well amongst us, especially those of us who work in this field, which are an emerging generation of multinational Indigenous peoples, someone whose grandmother may be Mohawk, but whose grandfather may be Mi'kmaq. People who have evolved new identities through the process of colonialization, whose representation isn't necessarily always as pronounced or as wrapped in ceremony as it probably should be. But we have to recognize that group of Indigenous people quite often are the ones who are in cities, and quite often are the ones who are on streets, and we need to find ways to recognize this emerging generation of individuals and recognize and pay respect to them as well as we begin. I would also like to bring apologies from the minister who I work with, Minister Jean-Yves Duclos, with the announcement yesterday of the fall economic update, and in particular the upgrading and the bringing forward of a stronger and more improved Canada Child benefit. He has work he has to do both in Ottawa and across the country in terms of explaining what's going on and how it's happening. And that also ties into, which I think is an extraordinarily important announcement that was made yesterday, which is a strengthening of the working tax benefit. These are really good measures, but they're not what I'm here to talk about. So I've once again been given a really beautiful speech by the hard workers in my department, and once again I will not read it. I've read it, but I'm not going to read it out to you. If you need to know what's in it, it's roughly what I'll talk about now. I'd like to begin though by acknowledging a session I sat in on last year at this conference that was on Indigenous youth and some of the challenges serving that population in urban centers. And I'm going to get the name wrong. I think I've been looking for that. I'm really bad with names. I really apologize. But I approached the young man. He's from Edmonton. I think his last name is Ken Robinson. If I'm getting it wrong, I apologize. But he gave a really moving presentation of how he was working upstream around prevention, how he was bringing kids and young people who had made some tough choices, some bad choices, back into a family, back into community to be healed. He talked about a moose hunt that they went on and really sort of reconnected these young people to the power of their lives and trying to instill some respect in how that power can be utilized. And I approached him afterwards because I'd been asked to do some work on the urban Aboriginal housing strategy by Minister Bennett at the time, and asked him for some advice. And he gave me the best advice I've ever received at a conference. The best advice I've ever received as someone who's been working on homelessness and housing for a long time, which was not to talk to him until I'd talked to the elders. He said, you must seek guidance and permission to pursue a line of questioning before you actually start to talk to people and get all excited about an idea. You've got to ground yourself in ceremony. You've got to ground yourself in a worldview that's different than yours. And you've got to talk to the elders before you talk to us young ones about the way forward, because they're the ones with the history. They're the ones who carry the wisdom that they share with us, that guide our principles. And before I talk to you, I need to know that you've done that. And so for the last year, I've had quite a journey. Joe Hester at Anishinaabe Health in Toronto has been enormous help. And as we've started to do some work, and I'll get to the policies about the National Housing Strategy, but more importantly, the HPS, the homelessness money, first, we took the advice, and we have started every one of our meetings with an elder. even when we're not dealing with Indigenous issues, because the chances are if you're dealing with homelessness in this country, you are dealing with people of Indigenous heritage or background. Sometimes they don't know it until they start to heal. Sometimes you don't know it until you start to really move towards them as a person. Sometimes you don't know it because it's simply beyond your worldview. And that's part of the education we have to do and part of the wisdom that has been shared with us over the time. And the Mi'kmaq Elder in Nova Scotia, and I've asked permission to share these lessons because I think they're important and they've been granted permission, but the Mi'kmaq Elder gave us 3 principles to operate under that are based on how Mi'kmaq peoples guide their thinking and guide their work together. And the 3 principles are really quite phenomenal when you use them to then approach the work around homelessness and around housing. The first one was wise counsel. And wise counsel is something that you kind of take for granted unless you really stop and think about what that means. And what it means in terms of the work we're doing is making sure we're getting the best advice possible. That means we start with people with lived experience. It means we talk to frontline workers who hold the hands, who literally clip the toenails of people whose feet are tired and damaged. We talk to the people who organize the frontline workers. We talk to people who fund the frontline workers. And we talk to people who think about these problems but don't actually deal with them on a day-to-day basis. And you move out from that circle and you get wise counsel, but it starts by listening to people with lived experience. The need for people with lived experience to be at your boardroom tables, on your frontline staff being paid, guiding and designing the programs, delivering the programs, talking to other individuals with lived experience, that is at the heart of wise counsel. It's taken us too long to get there. It's not something to applaud. As I say to everyone, don't thank us until we have ribbons being cut. But wise counsel also means some other things, and it means to listen in with humility. It's the 7 teachings of the grandfather teach us from the elder that opened our exercise in Toronto, a Mohawk elder who asked us to not be quite so confident. And one of the things I'm going to ask of you as we move towards the National Housing Strategy, and as we move towards HPS being reprofiled and reinvigorated, is that you grant us a couple of things. The first is we're going to make mistakes. We are not going to get this right. Look across this room at the 1,000, I think Tim said 1,507 people. Tim's about the data. But 1,500 of us here, and you all probably have 10 people back home, and you probably have 100 clients that you work with. We will not get it right for every person, every time, in every community. And we need to hear back from you, the wise counsel, on how to constantly fix the programs. It's not about getting it right off the dock, pushing the boat across the water and hope it makes it to the other side. We need everybody on board rowing and giving us course correction and making sure that the rocks under the water or the waves that are coming or the additional people on the other shore or an island in between is reached. So while we pursue this program of a new era of housing in this country, you're going to have to give us permission to fail, and you're going to have to give us the wise counsel to fix the problems as they emerge, and we're counting on you. And I know that's another burden to place on you, but the burden is ours. The opportunity is yours to give us that counsel. The other thing is that it's not going to be enough. And this comes from the notion that we have spent 25 years creating this crisis. We've spent more than 150 years making sure the crisis could happen through colonialization. We are not going to fix this problem quickly, and we're going to have to be patient with each other as we try to find a better way forward. The second piece of advice is provision for all. That's where the National Housing Strategy has to get us. Being able to provide the housing and the support that's required to provide for all of us in this community, in this country. And provision for all is not about simply funding programs. It's not about housing. It's about housing people. And we have to reorient the program to focus in on how we house people, not just meeting targets. Yes, there need to be targets, so we have some accountability, and we'd like to keep the accountants happy and the Auditor General's pleased. But we have to think about this process as housing people, not simply building housing or moving people into housing and saying their job done. This is critical. And this notion of provision for all means we have to find a way to reach people in different ways. So part of what we've been looking at is to end a series of federal programs that then push into provinces and push into communities and push into situations where you kind of have a mosaic of programs, where you've got a little tiny pocket of money for rent supplements, or a little tiny pocket of money for renovations, or a little tiny pocket of money for staffing, and a little pocket of money for people with mental health issues, or a little pocket of money for Indigenous youth, or whatever it is. And we have to start thinking about it, instead of the system being a mosaic with these specific little tiles, we have to collage the program and have deliberate overlaps, so that persons and people that are receiving, or families that are receiving a housing first installment, transition towards something, and that point of transition overlaps so there isn't a gap. Those little mosaic tiles have cracks in them, and those quite literally are the cracks that people fall between. And so provision for all means that the system has to change in the way in which we approach it, and the flexibility and the combination of programs has to be accentuated rather than defined, so that we can find ways to make sure people transition as they solve crises, transition as they heal, transition as they gain strength, transition as they come back to help others. We have to make sure that those programs and those policies fit together. And again, that comes into this notion of provision for all. We're going to have to find 100 different ways to house 100 different people. And it's not simply 2 or 3 big programs that kind of get the job done. We have to do that in real time. And again, we're going to need your wise counsel to get there. And the final piece, because the Mi'kmaq people were largely nomadic people who followed food sources along coastlines, up rivers, and into the interior of Turtle Island. But the Mi'kmaq didn't really have, when I asked, I said, walk me through how you settled, how you housed each other. And it was a series of camps. But what they recognized and what the elder told us was that it was really about the journey. And so the third sort of guiding point of wisdom is a principle which I think is really the most important one out of the 3 in some ways, and that is safe journey. We have a responsibility, and I think you start to see this reflected in the housing policy, of making sure people don't just have a place they're from and a place they're going to, but that transition, that journey, is as safe as possible. And so the programs and policies that we're going to be unveiling around a national housing strategy, and more importantly around the homelessness policy, is about making sure people get that assistance to achieve that safe journey as they choose to move to where they want to go, as they choose to leave where they are. And empowering people to make that decision and giving you the resources to assist in that safe journey, I think will give us a profound result over the next decade. So very quickly, the National Housing Strategy is having the finishing touches put on it right now in the Minister's office. It's what we've been working on all week as it gets set and it gets ready to be presented to Cabinet before it gets presented to the country, hopefully, fingers crossed, within a few weeks, probably within the next month. That policy is going to focus on some very broad areas with additional funding. There's about $40 billion in the system that we're going to be profiling into the National Housing Strategy. Much of it will flow through provincial and territorial governments to make sure we maximize the matching funds to really strengthen the program and build it and lock it in for a period of 10 years, which we've heard is the most important thing, is the length of the investment, the stability of the system, so we can really start to do some long-range planning and get you off one-year cycles, and compliance audits that take place every week. But the other component of this, which is really critically important, is it's going to focus on really 3 critical areas. It's going to focus in on supporting people with subsidy, either place-based or portable. But the existing operating agreements are guaranteed, they're locked in and reinvested. That's good news. It was in the budget, so it's not really new news. The second part is making sure that the capital program does both repair and builds new housing. You can't have housing first. You can't have housing first without housing first. And so those are the 3 main components. And as strong and as good and as glorious as the program can be, if we don't tackle this problem for Indigenous peoples in cities in particular, but on reserves as well, right across the country from coast to coast to coast. If we don't find a way to deal with that issue, we are going to be perpetuating the problem of the crisis on our streets and our communities right across the country. And while the National Housing Strategy is a broad-based program, there's an additional component which has to be worked out with First Nations, Métis Nation, and Inuit peoples, as well as urban housing providers or off-reserve housing providers. That part is part of a national housing strategy, but the phrase "nothing about us without us" is critical to the way in which we're approaching this issue. The Aboriginal or Indigenous or the Métis, Inuit, or First Nations, that component is yet another chapter which will be added to the National Housing Strategy in consultation, in collaboration with Indigenous leaders and housing providers right across the country. The program is a solid one, but it starts by dealing with homelessness immediately. And that's where the HPS reprofiling comes in. And the HPS reprofiling, we're having a meeting tomorrow with the community advisory boards and the community entities that are present here today. We have an advisory board. Tim is part of it. I just saw Holly walk in. I saw Robert on the way in, and then Karen is here. I think there's some other members of the advisory committee. We'll be having a meeting tomorrow with CABs and CEs about this process. But on that particular issue, we have heard some extraordinarily important things from people who are on the front lines right across the country. And those principles will be released very shortly. It's going to cabinet, so I can't talk about it too much, because once we give advice to a minister, we're supposed to shut up as parliamentary secretaries. But let me assure you of a couple of things that I think are critical. We've heard loud and clear that the definition of homelessness must change. We've heard loud and clear that waiting for someone, in particular youth, to become homeless before we help them is absurd and cruel and unusually damaging to young people, and we have to stop that. And we've heard that supportive housing in particular, Housing First cannot just be about putting someone in an apartment and saying your job is done. That supportive housing with supports, it requires an all-of-government approach. And it requires all of us in government, whether we're in Indigenous affairs, whether we're in immigration and refugee systems, whether we're veterans affairs, whether we're dealing with mental health or addiction, whether we're dealing with youth, whether we're dealing with the environmental upgrades that are required to build stronger and better housing that's more efficient to operate. Every single department of government has got to have a housing strategy that feeds into the National Housing Strategy, and that's the work that's going to be done to support the HPS program as it transforms into not simply managing a crisis, but solving the crisis over the next decade. That's our commitment to you as a government, and that's our commitment to Canadians as they seek to find the housing they need. Again, I apologize that Minister Duclos wasn't here to deliver the speech that I could have delivered word for word. It's a good speech, but I think the real work that is going to be done is over the next few days as you talk about the circumstances in your communities, you talk about the experiences that you're trying to deal with and solve. Our job as a government is to listen, and to listen deeply, and we'll be doing that for the next couple of days. And if you have questions, ideas, or proposals, please don't, I'll be here, don't hesitate to approach. And I'll end with one of the things that a Dene elder, when we were up in Yellowknife, talked about as we contemplated how to deal with this. And this is a bit of a word of a warning to all of us. If we're going to solve this problem, this conference has to get smaller over the next 10 years, as fewer and fewer of you deal with homelessness and more of you deal with housing. And that requires us to stop thinking of, and this is the words she used, of having these little garden plots of poor people and making sure we always have a fresh planting every spring so there's a harvest to get funding. We have to actually get it to the point where the individuals are getting the funding and not the organizations, where the individuals are succeeding, not the community organizations, and where people stop becoming homeless and don't end up in that garden, but rather can blow like seeds across the country and land where they want to and start the forests where they want to. I'm going to leave you with one last thing as we talk about seeds, and I'll give the microphone back. We'll still have 15 minutes and probably a little over. One of the elders that I also spoke to is someone who talked about rules. And this is really guiding a lot of the work we're doing. We're trying to get rid of many of the rules as possible. And the reason we're doing that is because of the piece of wisdom that was shared. Every time the federal government or a provincial or a government in this country creates new rules around a program, we deepen colonialism. And if you think of it like a tree, those rules and regulations are colonialism. And so when we say you can only have 2 years of subsidy, or you've got to be homeless for 6 months, or you can't be youth in care and get transitioned to a rent subsidy until you've shown us you have demonstrated needs, every time we drive those rules and regulations into programs, we deepen the colonial experience for all of us. And the trouble with deepening the roots and these rules and these roots of colonialism is that when you do that, a tree will do what it naturally does, which is grow its branches. And those branches do two things. They get complicated with other issues, and they make their rules less and less healthy and less capable of sustaining the complexities that they've created. But it also stops the sunlight hitting the forest floor. And so for those seeds that we hope to spread across the country, when the trees get too big, the seeds don't take and the new ideas don't take hold. And so his advice was to stop focusing on deepening these rules and regulations and these roots of the government structures, to think about trimming the branches so to lighten the load on the system and give more opportunity for new people with new ideas to take root and provide new ideas and solutions and systems to take place. That wisdom has been guiding all of the work we're doing around the National Housing Strategy. And we hope that we come up with a simpler, stronger, and more effective system. But if we don't actively house people and only try to build housing, we won't get there. And if you don't give us the ability to fail and fail fast and learn from experience and give us your wisdom, the journey won't be safe. And if the goal is provision for all, it's going to take all of us pitching in one last time over the next decade to put an end to 25 years of horror. I heard today one of the elders said that they lost somebody. Let's lose that experience, and let's keep those people amongst us. Thank you.